Okay, so we are recording, and we are excited to share some information with you guys today. We're excited to meet you all and answer any questions you might have. I'm going to, is everyone, you can see my screen okay, I think? Anna, thumbs up. Okay, we got a nod from Anna. Okay, fantastic. So good morning, folks. My name is Jim Shaw, and I am from Fastway Engineering, and I'm joined by Anna. We'll do some formal introductions in a second here, but the two of us are going to be walking through, I think, a really, really exciting topic, which is sort of the trends over the last, say, 10, 15 years in the miniaturization of optics. And I was looking at all the people who signed up for the webinar, and there's a pretty big trend, and it just seems like most of us who are here this morning are sort of early in our journey in optics. And still somewhere in sort of the research phase. And so one of the key technologies we're going to be going over in a bit more detail today are metalenses and metasurfaces. So we're going to talk a little bit about that and their applications. And then Anna's going to walk us through a really cool kind of a deep dive workflow on what we do here at Ansys and the Ansys family for presenting a design and analysis workflow. So we're going to keep it kind of high level for most of the webinar, but we are going to dig in a little bit. We're excited to get any questions for those who are familiar or just curious about learning more. So I will kick us off here. So my name is Jim Shaw, based in Chicago, Illinois, and I run a company called Fastway Engineering. We're a channel partner of Ansys. We serve the Great Lakes area in the Midwest region, and so I call myself optics adjacent, mechanical engineer, but have worked for several companies that have been in the optics and optics packaging space, both in aerospace as well as sort of commercial industrial. And I'll let Anna introduce herself.
Thank you very much. I'm Anna Wirth-Singh. I'm a senior application engineer on the numerical team here at Ansys. So I work on the numerical about, on all applications involving that software. So you might be familiar with our FDTD solver. I spend a lot of time with that, but we also have some solvers for waveguide called, Mode. I also do a bit of ZMax, which is our ray tracing software as well. And prior to joining Ansys as an application engineer, I did my PhD in metal optics at the University of Washington. So this is a topic I enjoy talking about very much.
Okay, great. I had a little bit of a cutout on the audio there, Anna. I'm not quite sure. Hopefully it clears up here just for a second. So yeah, so for those who are new to the term here, let's just take a step back. So a meta lens, also known as a metasurface, is really just a surface with sort of a texture on it, right? We call it a nanostructure, and it's specifically a nanostructure that is measured at a particular size. Nowadays, within the last, say, 10, 15 years, we've had the technology available to actually manufacture these surfaces or these lenses down in sort of the ultraviolet range. So we now have the opportunity to be tuning and customizing and really designing specifically for control down at that length, right? So visible light, of course, in sort of the 400 to 700 range, but through the latest sort of etching, if you will, or other manufacturing technologies, we've been able to actually start to tune these surfaces. So they're very, very thin, very small, very light, and as a result provide a lot of opportunities there. There's been quite a bit of research in this sort of, in the academia sort of area, but certainly within the last 10-ish years, we've seen sort of an explosion in interest and curiosity and commercialization. So we can see some sort of papers here, some public white papers here, all within the last 5-10 years. So pretty exciting, pretty cutting edge. And where we're seeing these applications are pretty much all industries, right? A lot of the AR, VR systems that are coming out and being used both on the consumer and on the industrial side. So whether it's a vision system for a machine, whether it's human in the loop or not, or we're obviously seeing a huge trend in in transportation, right? Going from ADAS level 2, let's say, where we've got just a variety of sensors and sort of talking sort of somewhat to the control system, to the vision, right, of ADAS levels 4 and 5, where we have full autonomous. So those are going to require an extremely high level of control and quality at the optical sensor level. And again, everybody kind of wants this. Consumers maybe don't know what they're asking for sometimes, but what we as engineers hear from them is they ask us for more sensors, more vision systems, right? More LiDAR, more autonomous, is really what they're telling us is, can you make it smaller, right? Can you reduce its complexity? Can you reduce its size? And for a lot of those that don't know, what they're also asking for is, can you increase their stability through broader and broader temperature ranges, right? It's sort of easier to make a camera, if you will, that's going to live in an office space. It's a little bit easier than making a camera that might have to live, say, on the front of a vehicle that has to be out there in Minnesota cold weather and Arizona hot weather. So that's really driving a lot of technical advancements in optical design. And Metalenses kind of offer a solution to those of us who've been looking for this. So, first and foremost, they're just small, right? I mean, we're measuring the contours of the surface down at the nanometer level, but the physical size, and Anna's got some examples for us, but the physical size is just incredible, right? And because of this control, and you can kind of see in the graphic in the upper right, we have very specific, very local control over intensity, say polarization, right, and the particular phases. And what we're getting from that is, say, an improved ability to get high quality 3D images, right? When they're small, they're usually cheaper. Okay, when we're able to, instead of take a 3 or 4 lens stack and combine it into a single part, yes, cutting edge manufacturing techniques are there, but we also have less parts. And so we have downstream less maybe labor, less assembly. We're taking advantage of a very hot topic right now, for those who read the news, is our semiconductor supply chain. So we're able to work closely with our partners, with our suppliers, and in one single part design something that's really unique for us. What is really important for a lot of aerospace and defense applications, where we're trying to, say, move or direct a lot of energy, is that thermal stability, right? There might be a lot of energy going through these lenses, and with their size being smaller, right, that coefficient of thermal expansion is applied to less material. Less material, less volume means less expansion at higher extreme temperatures. So, and particularly because we're talking about some of the etching processes that we're familiar with in semiconductor, we do have the ability to do a little bit of rework, a little bit of reflow if needed. So, I'm going to hand it over to Anna, and we'll have her share some great information with us.
All right, thank you very much. So I want to start off by just showing you some pictures that show you what meta lenses look like, when you're actually dealing with them. It's a physical thing. So there's a, broad size scale involved in meta lenses. As you mentioned, they're composed of these nanostructured components, and I'll get into a little bit more detail about those little meta atoms and how they're designed. But you build them up into a larger, macroscopic lens-like object, which can span the scale of, on the left here, we have a grain of salt-sized meta lens suitable for miniaturized applications like ultra small cameras and endoscopes. And then there's been a push in the industry to make larger and larger diameter meta lenses. So now meta lenses, unlike conventional lenses, as you can increase the diameter and make them larger and larger in aperture without having to make the lens any thicker. And this is really interesting for ultralight telescopes and drones and things like that. So on the left, we have a grain of salt-sized meta lens, and on the far right, we have what is, to my knowledge, the largest visible scale meta lens ever produced. It came out in a paper, and they very interestingly used this to take a picture of an eclipse that happened a few years ago. So that's a picture of two sort of the extremes in meta lenses, and then in the middle, this picture that you're looking at is what a lot of meta lenses look like in the lab. So what you're looking at here is a 4-inch glass wafer, and each one of those 100 or so scribed circles inside is a metal lens. So it's an array of metal lenses in this case on a larger wafer. And what they're trying to show you is you can see that the focal spots are forming on a sheet of paper behind it, showing you that this is an array of lenses. Next slide, please. Great. So now we know that what our metal lenses are and why they're interesting. We have to get into the challenges of why they're hard to design. Why you might need some advanced software to do it. The main thing when it comes to designing metal lenses, you have these vast size scales involved. On one side, you have this unit cell, which is sub wavelength. So for visible light, which is around 400 to 700 nanometers. Typically, each one of those pillars is going to be 100, 200, 300 nanometers in diameter. So you have this very small unit cell, which requires sub-wavelength modeling techniques. But you want to build up millions of these over some surface area that's going to be macroscopic. So simulating a large object at that level of detail is not always feasible. So that's why you need often different design tools and kind of to stitch together results from that small scale and that large scale to get an accurate simulation of the whole object. Another special challenge with metal lenses is wavelength dependent effects. Ordinary lenses are somewhat chromatic. But metal lenses are more so chromatic, and that can introduce, like all diffractive optics can introduce a number of challenges that are hard to understand, hard to simulate, and you have to come up with creative ways of dealing with them. And then the third and final thing, which Jim already touched on, is they can be difficult to fabricate, as fabricating such small structures requires very high resolution lithography techniques, which are rapidly increasing, but that was a blocker for many years in actually making metal lenses. So nowadays, metal lenses can, as you saw in the previous slide, can range from hundreds of microns, millimeters in diameter, all the way up to the centimeter scale. But now I'll go a little bit deeper into the design workflow and the simulation tools. So when it comes to designing metal lens, the design is typically done at the two different size scales, and then they're stitched together to make the larger object. So on the left side of this diagram, you have separately the unit cell design and the target phase profile design. So in the unit cell design, you typically simulate one block of the metal lens under periodic boundary conditions, assuming it's in an infinite array. And then separately, you design the target phase. This can come from an analytical formula. There's an expression, that tiny equation there, for the ideal phase profile to achieve focusing at one wavelength and normal incident light. You could also use software like Zemax, or if you have some other idea of a phase profile, you just have to know what phase profile you want. And then the key step in most metal lens design is just taking that library of unit cells and placing them accordingly to make that target phase profile. So once you've done that, you're essentially done. You could take that straight to your fabrication. So what you would do is you'd make what's called a GDS file, some kind of a layout file, send it to fabrication, and the lithography machine would actually make it, and then you can measure it. Typically, before you take that step, you'd want to do some additional design validation. So in this case, when you have your design sort of complete, you have your array of metal lenses placed, you could do design validation at the various scales. So on the most detailed method, you have something like numerical FDTD, finite different time domain, which is basically solving Maxwell's equations in small steps in space and time. Very detailed, but at the same time more computationally expensive. At the farther end of the spectrum, you have ray tracing, which is suitable for simulating and optimizing large optics very quickly, very well used in refractive optics, but does not capture the wavelength, the wave nature of light that is important when you're talking about meta optics. And then in the middle, you have some physical optics propagation techniques. This would be sort of ways that are treating the light as a wave, a much faster way of simulating and propagating light than full FDTD. So depending on the computational resources you have available and the size of your Metalens, you'd want to use one of these three methods typically, or some combination thereof, to do some final design validation before you send it to experiment. So now on the next slide, I'll go into just a little bit more detail on the two parts of designing Metalenses. So first is that unit cell design. So when we talk about the unit cell, it's typically a set periodicity. So usually a square lattice. We're going to make every unit cell, say 350 nanometers in square size. And what you're changing is typically the radius of this pillar in the middle. So this pillar is often circular or square in cross section, but you can certainly make more complicated shapes that have different properties. So the goal here is to come up with a library of pillars that can provide 0 to 2 pi phase shift at your wavelength of incidence. So you typically need to run some sweeps and some simulations to first find a height that's going to work. Generally speaking, if the pillar is taller, it's easier to achieve that 0 to 2 pi phase shift because there's more material there to adjust with. But at the same time, you don't want your pillar to be too tall, or it might not withstand the fabrication process. You have to find an ideal height to work with, and then you typically want to sweep the radius or the width of the pillar and just come up with a set of pillars that can give you 0 to 2 pi phase shift. You can do this using FDTD simulations instead, but it's also really common to use another method called rigorous coupled wave analysis, or RCWA for short, which is a semi-analytic method and is really a way to quickly and accurately simulate the phase response of these unit cells. One thing I'll just mention briefly is that underpinning this is what we call the local phase approximation, which basically means we are simulating this unit cell under periodic boundary conditions. So we're pretending that this one unit cell is situated in the lattice of likewise unit cells going out infinitely in all directions, which is not exactly the case when you build a Metalens. The adjacent cells, it's going to be changing a different cell at each location. But over the vast majority of the lens, it's a good approximation to use, and it really enables you to do this to separate these two steps to make it a computationally feasible problem. I think we're ready for the next slide. And then the final step in designing Metalenses is to map the meta atoms onto your target phase profile. So this is typically done with some kind of a script, can be your script language of choice, MATLAB, Python, something of that nature, to basically go through your target phase. You need to discretize that into some kind of array, go through each location, what is the phase that you want, and just picking out the pillar from the library that gives you the closest to that possible phase. To iterate through, place all your pillars, and then take it on to your further validation. And I'll reiterate that this target phase profile can come from an analytic function. The hyperboloid phase profile on the slide is very commonly used. That's an equation for what the phase profile needs to be to achieve diffraction limited focusing at one wavelength and one angle of incidence. However, I'll mention that the performance of this particular phase profile deteriorates pretty quickly away from the ideal conditions, that is, away from the design wavelength and a wider field of view. So you might want to design your own phase profile that's going to be more resilient under your design conditions. In this case, DMAX has a binary 2 surface type, which basically expresses the phase profile as a polynomial that you can optimize. So you optimize the the phase profile to fit your particular needs, and then you can convert that into a Metalens. All right. So, Jim, do you want to take it back from here?
Yeah, thank you. What I find interesting, right, Anna, is this challenge that we have on the design sort of workflow side is really computational ceiling, right? And we see this in a lot of different physics and simulations, right? Whether it's not just optics, but we see it in heat transfer, we see it in fluids, of course, we see it in structures, which is the phenomena that we most care about or we most want to control is at a very small level, right? But the macro effects are what our customers are judging us on, let's say, right? And so we've always had this computational ceiling, and we're going to continue to be up against it, I think. So it's really cool for you to show us that, we're at the nano level, sort of dialing in those columns, right? Those cylinders in their geometry, but also trying to analyze it at the macro level, because that's really what our customers are going to be experiencing. So yeah, the next 3 slides are really just where to find more information, right? We're gonna kind of bring it back up to the high level again and open up for Q&A. But I've got 3 sort of articles here, and these slides will be shared on our website and sent out afterwards as well. But again, maybe a lot of us are still in sort of that research phase on whether it's optics as a whole or just in Metalenses. So there's 3 articles here that I've linked, and they show a little bit about some, again, challenges maybe specific to a certain industry. And so here we have co-packaged optics, which we're seeing particularly in data centers and high I/O, right, where we're basically packaging everything together. And I don't know, Anna, if you've got a few words, anything unique on this particular application?
Sure, I can add specifically where Metalenses are often used in co-packaged optics is in this coupling to get light in and out of the chip. So you are going to have some optics integrated on this chip, and you need to get that light. Often, if you have light coming from a laser into and out of that chip via a grating coupler and some kind of a lens, it's going to be focusing it down towards the grating coupler. So there's a strong desire to make that very compact and very efficient, and that's one thing that Metalenses are specifically useful for. Thank you.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, and then one of the applications we mentioned at the beginning are some of the more sort of experiential applications for optics. Of course, AR, VR, which it's not just about video games anymore. I don't know if it ever really was, right? But there's a lot of immersive sort of experiential products now, both on the consumer side and on the industrial side. And so for these particular applications, we've got this article here really kind of walks through, I think, a bit of a deep dive on a little bit of the analytical you can see on the left-hand side, and then a little bit more on the sort of the application side, in our ZMAX, right, and how to really design for these applications.
Yeah, I can add that Metalenses are really well suited to AR, VR applications because they're very thin and very light, and this is one of those applications where weight really matters. You don't want to have a big heavy thing. And also because Metalenses are transparent, you can see through them, but they still lens the light, so that's very useful for an eyeglass type form factor.
Yes, I'm starting to see commercials for these things now, right? And then the third application we wanted to share as well, right, is specific to healthcare and sort of medical application here, right? But we mentioned size, right? And so when you want to say diagnose, we're seeing a lot of technologies with a fiber endoscope, right? We're able to get a physical, visual insight into what's happening sort of in situ, if you will, right? And again, this article right here kind of walks through a little bit more of sort of the standard sort of the challenge that we're trying to solve, and then some very specific applications using our tools. All right. Well, thanks for joining this morning. That brings us almost to the 30-minute mark. Again, we wanted to thank you guys for joining and share some of the new technologies that are out there for shrinking optics and the unique workflows that we have. Again, depending on whatever problem you're trying to solve, the workflow that Anna walked us through uses several of the software tools that we have so that we can solve this problem both at the nano scale and at the macro scale. We've got a couple of QR codes here, which will take you directly to two articles. Again, more sort of workflows and work instructions, for lack of a better term, kind of deeper dives on both small scale and large scale Metalens design. And with that, I will open the floor to any Q&A from the audience.
Hey Jim, I just have one quick question for you.
Sure.
Hey, is this hard to learn?
Is this hard to learn? Well, judging by the question, you must be, new and early in your journey through optics. I mean, I'm as an optics adjacent mechanical engineer, I've got my answer, and then maybe I'll let Anna, who has dedicated her career to this discipline. But I think that optics design requires a team of folks. I don't think that one person's going to sit there and just hammer out a full design, right? So as somebody who sort of self-identifies as optics adjacent here, I personally I'm a technically curious person, right? And I think the tools have started to lean, away from, say, code writing and text-based tools to more interactive tools that maybe look and feel more like a CAD tool, right? A 3D design tool, which is sort of the world that some of us mechanical engineers live in more. So I see the trend of that learning curve being flattened over time. So I would say it's not hard to learn, but it's certainly going to require dedicated attention. I do not recommend that somebody learn these tools specifically in the optics arena on a part-time basis. I think it takes a lot. You have to kind of dedicate yourself. Sometimes that requires telling your manager to back off for a couple of weeks or something like that. So I don't know, Anna, certainly I'm curious, what are your thoughts?
Absolutely. That's a really great question. Because I remember getting into Metalenses, I remember the start of my journey from years ago, and it can seem, I think, overwhelming at first because there's a lot of components. There's this small scale, there's this large scale, there's how do you stitch them together. It looks like almost it can look like an overwhelming problem. But once you actually get into it, like, take a proper deep dive, it's probably not as bad as you think it is. It really is, if you can just break it up into the small steps of designing your unit cell, designing your phase profile, and then bringing them together. That is all you need to design a basic metal lens. So then I'll add at one wavelength. Where things start to get pretty hairy and much more challenging is when you want to design multi-wavelength metal lenses or start analyzing metal lenses at multiple wavelengths. That is a substantially more challenging problem. It introduces a lot of complications. So it's a very open area. If you want to design a simple metal lens at one wavelength, it's probably not as bad as you think it's going to be. And metal lenses are, as an experimentalist, I can tell you they're probably more resilient than you think they're going to be. I remember thinking the first metal lens I designed, I was like, there's no way this is going to work. I had to have made a mistake somewhere. I think a lot of people have that experience, but it actually, it may not work super well if you made some mistake, but as long as you have some kind of a circular shape with a phase gradient, it will do some lensing. So it's probably more resilient than you think it's going to be. Metal lenses at one wavelength are not too bad. I would say significant challenges start to appear when you're concerned about multiple wavelengths effects. And that's also where a lot of the research is nowadays.
Very cool. Very cool. Speaking of research, if you were to project forward, maybe 5 or 10 years, where do you, what's next? Where are we going with this? Any thoughts on that, Anna?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's another really great question. So one thing that's been on the top of everyone's list and everyone would love to figure out how to do is to make a tunable metal lens. So Metalenses give you control, this pixel by pixel control of the phase, but in most cases, after you fabricate the device, it's so the phase profile, it's like it's a static lens in that case, which is great for many applications. But if you could tune it, say electrically, that would be a game changer. So that's one area that people are actively working on. And to my knowledge, I don't think there's a great solution yet. So one is tunable or active metal lenses. And another one, which I have to mention, is AI ML techniques, both in the design aspect of metal lenses and also when you're using metal lenses for imaging applications, for doing some kind of image reconstruction. So as I mentioned, the chromatic wavelength dependent effects can be a challenge in metal lenses. So one of the ways that people are circumventing that challenge is not trying to, well, they are trying to do better metal lens design. But if you have decided you can't get any better with the metal lens design, you can perhaps do better image processing on the back end. And with a really good understanding of how your metal lens is working, you can perhaps do better image reconstruction than you could otherwise. So those are the two areas I would say are at the top of the industry right now.
Very cool. Very cool. Any questions from any more questions from the audience?
Hi, Jim. I have a question.
Yes.
So does the current version of ZMAX support large-scale metal lens?
Yeah, I can answer that. Yeah, we do have a large-scale metal lens example. So it uses a custom DLL to read an H5 file. So if you go to the link, you can download the files in the example.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, so I can give you a broad overview.
I just checked the ZMAX, the lens object list, but it was not listed there. So I was wondering how your presentation had that in the ZMAX screenshots.
Yeah, so there's I guess there's two ways. So one, if you're designing the initial phase profile, it's a binary 2 type surface. That's the polynomial type surface where you start out. And then after you've sort of gone through the process with the numerical of assembling your metal lens, there will be a DLL file that you'd use instead.
So it's a DLL.
It's a custom DLL. Yeah, so the custom DLL will take your compiled saved data in the form of an H5 file, and it'll read back the phase and the amplitude at each position in that file. So a custom DLL.
Okay. And another follow-up question is, so that large-scale metal lens in the ZMAX is based on basically the ray tracing, not the physical beam propagation?
So that's another good question. So the large-scale metal lens is when it propagates from surface to surface through empty space, that's ray tracing, which is the fastest approach for large metal lenses. But at that interaction of the metal lens, it's using, the DLL is using results that are saved from a numerical simulation. So what we actually recently updated this approach without getting into too many technical details. We now call it the windowed Fourier transform approach. So what it is doing is it is actually doing some kind of physical optics propagation just around that interaction with the metal lens. So it looks at a section of the metal lens and determines if a ray hits that section, which direction it's going to go using wave optics techniques. So as the ray is interacting with this metal lens DLL object, it's doing some sort of wave-based optics, but ultimately it decides, okay, what direction is that ray going to go? And then it does ray tracing again from there.
So it basically takes into account the diffraction effects from the lens surface.
Definitely, yes.
Okay. And I guess the small scale metal lens is probably just only the feature in the software, like a numerical.
Exactly, yeah. Numerical for full wave FDTV. So the small scale metal lens will include any optical effect. All broadband results too. It's just a matter of computational expense.
Okay, thanks.
Good questions.
Hi, Anna. I have a couple of questions for you. This is Larry. Number one, when a designer is close to finishing up their design, what vendors might be out there to partner with to prototype these Metalenses? You know, for the lithographic portion of the process.
Yeah, the one I'm most familiar with is Voxtec, and we're working on a process development kit with Voxtec. There are others out there, but that's one I can suggest.
Okay, thank you. The other question was just, you know, you mentioned looking at more broadband Metalenses. And I don't know if Jim told you, we work with LED sources quite a bit. And so we're looking at a wave band of 20 to 30 nanometers for a single color LED. How tolerant might your Metalens design be of that sort of wave band? And how would you even simulate something like that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I'd say it would depend a little bit on your application. I would say if you're using that kind of a Metalens for imaging, and if you're just going to look at a picture taken with that Metalens, you probably wouldn't be able to notice much lack of clarity with your eye. But if you're doing an MTF measurement or a point spread function measurement, especially off axis, I'd say that would become more noticeable. So at 20 nanometers, I would say if you're looking especially at off axis light, what you might see is your point spread function seems a bit smeared out. And it really depends on the application whether it would be an acceptable amount of degradation for you. But so I can say in the small scale Metalens workflow, if you're using full wave FDTD, you can get broadband results kind of straightforwardly. So that's one way to straightforwardly get broadband results. Our large scale Metalens workflow has recently been updated to support multi-wavelength and multi-order. So in this case, you would need to simulate results at multiple wavelengths that can all be packaged into one file. And then you can simulate it with the DLL and Zemax like you would simulate other surfaces at multiple wavelengths. And since we're on the topic, I just wanted to mention, it is hairy to get into simulating the chromatic effects, but again, I would try to break it down into there's two things you have to worry about mainly. One is that the unit cell itself has some chromatic behavior. So the same unit cell is going to provide slightly different phase for different wavelengths. And then the second effect, which is actually more significant, is that the effect of the phase profile overall. So the same phase profile is going to provide different focusing behavior, different focal lengths to different wavelengths of light. So even if the unit cell itself didn't have any chromatic behavior, the phase profile itself is going to introduce some strong chromatic behavior because you design it for one wavelength and you kind of bake in that pattern when you fabricate it. And then the other wavelengths are going to basically have some shift in the focal